welcome to The Law Matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. As we say, this program has been created to educate, inform, and help you with law matters because the law matters. Understand the law better, and you're in a better position to decide how to protect yourself, your family, and your business. We continue to provide information and resources that'll help you to determine whether or not you actually want to handle some issues yourself. If you do need outside counsel, the idea, of course, is that you'll be better prepared, and so will the counsel that you select. Our goal, of course, as always, is to help you save time, money, and achieve the best possible results. We want to welcome again and thank our attorney, David Bizarre, from the Bizarre & Associates Law Firm in East Providence. He continues to weigh in on the issues that we tackle, providing his legal expertise and his insights and some amusing anecdotes as well. So today, money, and specifically structured settlements and annuities, such as those you hear about that are large sums from things like personal injury. Not only, there are more cases than that, but when you think about medical costs and you think about the personal, pain and injury claims, lots of money involved. And how do you prepare to protect yourself financially? It's nice to have the positive judgment. It's another story to get the money, and what should you do and how should you get it? How do you actually keep that large sum of money from being fractionalized by taxes? And how do you plan for your medical coverage? And how do you plan for the future? And what do you really need to consider? And how do you protect yourself from some of those allegedly helpful companies that tell you that you need to cash out and here's what you should do to do it? So there's an awful lot to cover, but considering that I guess the number is more than $6 billion in new structured settlements come out each year. So we thought with that kind of money, we should be tackling this topic and seeing if we can help you. So, okay, David, let's set this up. Provide some sort of context about the litigation and what goes on, what kind of cases that lead up to these sometimes astronomical amounts.
So primarily the type of case that would use a structured settlement can fall into two categories. One would be the catastrophic injury type of case, where you need a stream of income to pay for future medical needs, that type of thing. And then cases involving minor children, where you want to hold the money for the child until they reach a certain age.
And it could be, what kinds of cases? They talk about personal injury. They also talk about, at times it's workers' compensation or a wrongful death. What kinds of cases are those?
So workers' compensation cases obviously are injuries that occur at work. And when those cases are settled, sometimes a component of what might be settled are future medical bills. And so you may have an annuity or a structured settlement vehicle that pays money for future medical bills. Obviously, a wrongful death case involves somebody who was killed as a result of somebody's negligence, and it's just a form of a personal injury case of one type or another. And oftentimes, those cases can be structured with a structured settlement. If there are younger children who are beneficiaries in particular, you might do that. And catastrophic injuries, slip and falls, auto accidents where someone is either quadriplegic or has a traumatic brain injury, that type of settlement might require or be benefited by a structured settlement.
And of course, we need to say some people ask for or want the lump sum payout. So we should talk about that. But when people are about to be suing, sometimes you go to court and sometimes you have settlements. But there are things that we've talked about before with those personal injury cases of general, what do they call it, general damages, and then punitive and special. Could you go over those a little bit and talk about the relative amounts that get awarded?
Well, compensatory damages are, as they say, damages designed to compensate you for your loss. And that can be broken down into general damages or pain and suffering, that type of number on a settlement for pain and suffering is sort of a subjective number. We as attorneys and insurance companies on the other side oftentimes have ways that we measure those things. But for a jury, it's not scientific. It's what feels to be the right amount to compensate someone for what they went through. Special damages obviously are designed to replace things that you lost or that expenses you may incur in the future, such as past medical expenses or future medical expenses, past lost wages or future lost wages. Those can be actually calculated to a more mathematical precision than general damages. And punitive damages are damages that are only used in very specific kinds of cases to punish the defendant for their action or to encourage them to change the way they do things.
So you're a lawyer and you handle those cases. On what basis do you decide whether someone should really go to court and go the whole stretch versus settle it here and now and get it done? How do you make those decisions? How do you even factor in those issues?
The decision that's made is, can I come to a settlement that is going to be fair and reasonable and compensate my client in a way that makes sense, as opposed to I'm not going to settle for what is being offered because it doesn't compensate the client, and therefore you have to proceed to trial. So I'll give you an example of a case where we settled it and used a structured settlement to get the case done. I had a client who was severely injured in a slip and fall case and suffered a quadriplegic type of injury. So there were a number of factors that had to go into that settlement. Obviously, pain and suffering is a big component of it. This person was a very active woman who could no longer be active because of the injury. She was going to have a lifetime of medical needs and also would have to have some changes made in her house so that she could live there and have it accessible in a wheelchair. She'd have durable medical equipment needs in the future, replacement of medical devices that she was going to need, including a wheelchair, needed a van to be able to be transported around, which obviously she didn't have before, didn't need before, with a lift to lift the wheelchair up. Mm-hmm. So in those kinds of cases, you hire somebody to create a plan, a care plan, to say this is what the needs are for this person now and in the future.
By that, do you mean, do you mean a physical therapist or an occupational therapist as opposed to an accountant who knows more of the numbers or will do more of the number crunching? What's that complement of people who work together?
So in that case, we hired a professional medical planner to say, all right, here are all the medical records that I had to look at. These are the conditions that have been diagnosed based on our experience of someone suffering from this type of injury. These are the needs you're going to have. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, perhaps, not in this case, medical providers in the future, medical care, nursing care, home skilled nursing, visiting nurses, those types of things. So that person develops the needs and then the costs associated with that. Then we also have somebody else we bring in who would also look at that and look at the inflationary rate associated with those needs. And we also brought in a person who would take a look at that in terms of a structured settlement and say, how much would it cost today to invest in an annuity to cover those costs as they came forward? And you might not have a structure that pays a monthly amount every month because you might want to plan out, well, I don't need a new van every year. I might need a new van every 5 or 10 years. Mm-hmm. So a lump sum of money to come out to pay for that. Monthly money may be to pay for the nursing care or visiting nurses that I might need. Monthly money to pay for medical devices that I need, whether it's not in this case, but a respirator or bandaging and all of that type of stuff that might be needed. Whatever the needs are that are monthly and need to be compensated for. So in the particular case, we calculated out what all those needs were, what the pain and suffering was, and we entered into a settlement that had some money up front to cover the pain and suffering and some of the other damages that had already occurred, such as medical and wages to date, And then some of the money went into this structured settlement or annuity to pay out. And with an annuity of that type, first of all, it's based on a personal injury. So it's not taxable because personal injury settlements aren't taxable, and they grow. So the income that's growing inside that structured settlement isn't taxable, and it's growing to cover for inflation and that type of thing for the cost of what's going to, as they go up over the course of time. And they also come out as they're needed. So it's structured to work that way.
So clearly, when we've talked at times about some things being do-it-yourself, anticipating costs, projecting out those kinds of costs, I imagine that it's very safe to say that no single person is likely to be able to do it themselves when it comes to this. I can't imagine how they would be competent and knowledgeable in all of those areas at once to pull together what would be a reasonable number. Correct?
Not only is it not a do-it-yourself thing, even as an attorney experienced in those types of cases, a lawyer doesn't do it on his or her own. We bring in experts in different areas to help figure out all of these things and needs so that there is no issue in terms of what's going to get covered. And the other thing I wanted to point out with annuities and that with that is you can buy these annuities so that they are payable over your lifetime. So for the injured person. So if that person lives well beyond their life expectancy, they still can get paid and the money will still come out so it doesn't run out of money. And what we try to do when we have that kind of settlement is to make sure not only have we covered the person for the rest of their life, no matter how long they live,
yes,
but we also want to make sure that the money that gets put into that annuity gets paid out. So if you die before you're expected to, it doesn't just go away. There's some guaranteed period built into it to make sure money comes back out to your estate.
Good to know, because as we say, there are pros and cons to some of these things.
Correct.
So somewhere in the middle of all this, when you talk about what is tax-free, which makes sense and certainly can be a big number, is there an element, what did they refer to it as, the punitive damages or something that interest or something isn't accruing tax-free? I mean, obviously this is more intricate and we're not really meant to get into the weeds, but there are certainly some factors here in addition that people need to be aware of.
So punitive damages aren't damages that are compensating you for an injury, so they are taxable, potentially. And interest on an award or judgment, if you go to trial and you win and there's your award plus pre-judgment and potentially post-judgment interest, that's taxable. Interest is taxable. A settlement for personal injury in an annuity, even though there may be an interest component to it, is not taxable because the payments are coming out to compensate you for the personal injury. But if the structure includes other money, interest or something else, which it really wouldn't because it's usually based on a settlement and not an award or a verdict, those factors could include interest, income taxable events, and also if it's a structured settlement not for a personal injury, for lost wages based on employment discrimination or something of that nature, those could be taxable. And it's way too complicated to try to attack in 30 minutes, but basically those are the things you need to look out for.
And in the example that you were citing earlier, David, you mentioned that it was a woman, and how would your judgment about what needs to be structured be affected by, say, it being a minor versus it being an older person? I know that there are times when you think about how money is paid out and who needs to learn how to invest it versus squander it, versus anticipate how many more years they could live if they're young. How do those things factor in?
So oftentimes if a case is settled for a minor, say a 12-year-old child who is injured, there's some money that may come out up front because again you have bills that need to get paid, including medical bills that have been incurred, that type of thing. So on top of that, you want to put the bulk of the money away for that minor child. Some judges want it to come out when the child turns 18. Others, depending on how much it is, want it to come out over time so it's preserved for that child. But the amount of money that goes into the structure based on what the value of the settlement is. And how you value the settlement is not affected by the fact that you may structure some of it. In fact, when people first started dealing with structured settlements many, many years ago, there was a little bit of trying to pull the wool over one's eyes for the insurance company's part to people who were settling. Well, you're going to get this much money. Well, yeah, but it's over time. How much of it is going in today? I'm entitled to know what the structure costs so that I know what the value of the settlement is. And we don't usually settle cases with a structured offer and then settlement. We say, all right, we're going to settle it now for this amount of money, and this is how much money we're putting into the structure, and what will that produce? What's the internal rate of return, which is the interest rate that the annuity is paying?
So good that you brought this up. I understand that there had been, at some point, a lot of no, I don't want to say opacity. Maybe I do want to say. There are many occasions in many states where you, whoever's paying out wouldn't necessarily be forced to divulge how little they had to actually pay. Plus, there was this great unknown about what the projected or anticipated benefits were based on how long someone might live, based on their age versus based on the fact they had a terrible illness and they might have a shortened lifespan and all of these things. What has been done and what do people do in our states locally here to make sure that there's not that kind of hidden factor?
Right. Well, exactly what I'm saying is hire an attorney that deals with these kinds of cases, and the attorneys that do this, like I do, will know we're settling the case for this amount of money, plus we bring in our own structured settlement person. So we don't have to use the structured settlement company that the insurance company we're settling is bringing in. We bring in our own. And it's sort of like going to an independent insurance agent. They have the ability to get rates and quotes from many different companies that deal in this kind of practice. And they can come back and say, well, I can, and then of course we always have to look at how strong the company is that is writing the annuity, the structured settlement. And oftentimes, not only do we want to make sure that they're, whatever the highest rating is, AAA or whatever, if it goes up higher, but also that they are bonded for this settlement by another company that's strongly rated or highly rated.
Does the government, locally, federally, make sure that the insurance company can't, default on it or claim bankruptcy so that the person who's expecting to get this stream of payments suddenly has it derailed?
Like an FDIC insurance for a bank?
Okay.
So there is some of that, but more importantly, it's when you settle it, you make sure you have a strong company, and that company is then backed up by a surety bond or surety company from another company. So you insure the settlement.
So we hear on the late night TV, maybe not even late night TV, many companies will say, so you made this settlement and now you suddenly need cash, we'll buy your annuity. I imagine that there are some that are legitimate and the issue of buyer beware is an issue. Is that something that you would ever advise an individual to research himself, and if so, how would they do that, David?
So my advice is almost always don't sell your structured settlement. If you know why they're buying them and how they buy them to make money. So if you have a stream of payments and it's $1,000 a month for the next 10 years, and they're saying this is what we're going to give you, what they're doing is they're saying how much value is $1,000 a month for the next 10 years worth, and then we're going to discount that by an interest rate because we're giving you the money now, and they want to do it in such a way that it's profitable to them. That's why they do it. That's what they're in business for. So you know right off this from the start that you're discounting what the value of your annuity is to sell it. You're discounting it not only for the time value of money, because $1 today is worth more than $1 10 years from now, but you're also discounting it from the fact that it's getting put into a lump sum and they want to make money on what their investment or lump sum is to you. So I tell people not to do that, but sometimes they are in situations where they need the money for whatever reason, and that's what they want to do. And so there are rules in place where it's supposed to go to a Superior Court judge if it's a Rhode Island structured settlement, and the judge has to look at it with the Attorney General presenting the case to make sure that it's at least as close to fair and reasonable as it can be.
So earlier you had mentioned that there are times when you do a lump sum in the beginning and then have the stream of payments follow, some sort of hybrid plan. Suppose someone's situation changes so that there's suddenly a miracle cure and someone could do better if they had the money to now take advantage of this new offering. Or on the other side of it, maybe someone who had done a structured settlement with an annuity thinking that they'd be able to get another job, but it falls through. Or perhaps there's a foreclosure because they just couldn't make the rent payment, the mortgage payment, or whatever their situation changes, so that the word desperation comes in, which is obviously why some of these companies can prey on them as victims. What do you do legally, and what is the correct thing to do to save yourself if you find yourself in this situation?
Well, there's a bunch of different things in there, so let's unpack that a little bit. If you want to cash in your structured settlement, the court's not only going to look at whether or not what's being offered is fair and reasonable, but they're also going to look at the reason why you're trying to lump sum that annuity now. And some of the reasons you gave, there's now a miracle cure that I can pay for and be fixed. That's probably a very legitimate reason to want to get all the money now, and I'm sure the court would encourage that as long as that miracle's realistic. If it's like far-fetched and never going to really happen or work, and the court knows that, and you're being sort of bamboozled on the other side of this equation, the court's going to protect you and say no. If there's a foreclosure of a house and you have enough money in your annuity to pay the loan off and stop the foreclosure, and that's in your best interest, probably a good reason again, and the court might see that that's a proper thing to do. But the court really does dig in, and the Attorney General's office digs in a little bit. And if they think that, well, you know what, you become drug dependent as a result of your injury and you want this money to buy more drugs, and that's not in your best interest, they're going to look in and carefully try to ferret that out as well.
So if the situation changes, someone becomes desperate, you mentioned that they go to court. Again, is that something that someone could likely do on their own, or is that something where they would have had to have gone to a lawyer first, who then helps build the case, or helps even to explain to them why they shouldn't even bother going to court, but perhaps there's another way of handling it? How do you handle that?
Oftentimes they'll go on their own, and what will happen is the company that's come in to buy the annuity, the structured settlement, hires an attorney to file the paperwork to get the approval for that sale. And the Attorney General is there looking over everybody's shoulder to see what's going on in the settlement. And if the Attorney General and the judge and everybody else is on board, it goes through, so you generally don't need to hire an attorney to do that.
And when it comes to people who are taking those cases on, such as a lawyer, and you mentioned there are other consultancies that become involved. Yes, the payouts are millions. So many lawyers do want those cases because there's a percentage, a high percentage that, or a percentage that an insurance company might get on one side of it, that lawyers get on the other. So how does the unsuspecting, uninformed person get to know what really is being played out and how much money is on the table and commissions and all? How do they get to understand that?
Are you talking about settling in the first instance or selling after?
Let's do both, but settling in the first place, because many lawyers are taking those cases on contingencies, I
Yeah,
guess?
because they're usually personal injury cases.
Yes.
And frankly, as I said, we value the case for what the value of the case is. And the structured settlement part doesn't come up until after we've come to a conclusion of what the case might be worth. In the case where I was representing the person who was injured in the slip and fall, the case, we ended up at a value of $5 million. That's what we said the case was worth. That's what we were willing to settle for. After we got to that point, then we said, and this is how we want to take that money and structure it. And this is what we want up front, and this is what we want to put into the structure. And with the structured insurance person or structured annuity settlement agent that we hired, he went and got many different quotes to say, all right, this is what you can expect to get out. And here, this will be pay a lump sum at this point, this will pay a lump sum at this point, these will be the monthly payments. So that was all done after we came to whatever the value of the case was up front. So that's why it's just a personal injury case that
the first stage
that the attorney is using a structured settle to help bring the settlement about.
Okay, and then the second scenario that we were going to discuss, there has been a settlement, now there's going to be part two. How do those fees, how does those commissions get explained to, or do they even get explained to the person?
So most cases that I know of, they don't go, the person who has the structured settlement annuity doesn't go back to their attorney, doesn't even tell them about them. I find out about them sometimes because the attorney generals have called me up and said, hey, we're dealing with this case, tell us about this case. I get permission from my client to talk to them. I explain the case to them. I call my client up and I say, why are you doing this? I try to talk them out of it if it's not appropriate after I speak to them and get the information. But I don't charge a fee to talk to my client who I settled the case for to give them some advice 5 years, 10 years after the case as to whether or not they're making a good decision. I don't know if they've gone and hired other attorneys to help put it through. I don't know why they would have to. If the annuity company is paying, that's buying the structured settlement, for an attorney to file the paperwork with the court.
Good to know. So in the remaining time, could you tell us what happens if you are the attorney for the defendant, not the plaintiff, and say you lost. So there needs to be that settlement. How does that get packaged? How does that transaction and the process of that work when it comes to getting the insurance policy to make this work? How does that happen?
So from the insurance company's point of view that's settling the case, we look at the same thing that we would do in any case. It's how much is the value of the case, what's a fair settlement going to be. And we'll oftentimes probably try to say, hey, use our structured settlement company because the structured settlement company that's selling the annuity makes money in selling an annuity. And there's value to that. And so they're trying to keep that profit in-house oftentimes. And sometimes their product can be just as good as what we can get elsewhere. Sometimes it's not. So that's why we'll often deal with our independent guy on the other side to make sure that it's a good product, a good company, and a good rate of return. But that's what they're looking at. And oftentimes, as you say, they're trying to save money by saying that, well, look how much money we can give you over time, as opposed to this is what it's really costing us today.
I have one quick question. Do you have to disclose, if you're taking care of the defendant who has to buy this policy, do you have to tell that plaintiff, the one who's going to be awarded the coin, what the commission has been on it? If it's 4%, I hear that it could be 4%. I don't know what the rest of the numbers are, but do you have to explain that to anyone, or is that just between you and your client?
So if you're not representing somebody, I don't know what obligation you have to them, because you're not the annuity company telling them this is what they're buying. You're settling a case. So that's why you want to have an attorney represent you in a case that's settling with a structured settlement, so you know what it is you're getting and buying.
Good to know. We hope that this has been helpful to you. If you do have to deal with structured settlements, we hope that the information pro and con has been helpful, and including some of the quirks. Please do continue to stay tuned to the Law Matters. As we say, it matters to you.